Okay, so as you can tell, I'm lying in bed. I know it's not very clear, but the most important thing is if you can hear my voice. And the sound, at least, has been pretty decent recently. I want to talk about time, particularly comparing two decades, the 1980s and the 2010s, which we are coming to the end of now. Um, I've always been fascinated by time. I've always been fascinated by history. I'm very compelled by it, and I was just thinking about something. This is a topic that I've always wanted to touch on, but I wasn't quite sure about the angle to take. And I'll probably make more videos related to this, but I'll just touch on it now. And it's this. There's something about the 1980s popular culture, particularly thinking of film, and music for that matter, that just seems more fun and more innocent to me. Um, I've been thinking about all the implications around this Jeremy Kyle thing, but I was also which was watching Labyrinth yesterday, the classic fantasy film with Jennifer Connelly and David Bowie. Great film. Just fun, bit silly, bit weird, but just fun. And it's a very popular film with those who saw it from a relatively young age. I mean, Jennifer Connelly was only 16 when she done it. I was one when it was made in 1986. I was born in 1985, right bang in the middle of the 80s. And whilst I'm grateful that I was born in the 80s and not the 90s, because I remember a time before social media, um, I'm also kind of reflective on the fact that this generation, I don't know, something has changed. And it's hard to put my finger on, but something has definitely changed. It just seems to be less fun. I mean, take the difference in comedy. 1980s films, if we think of classic teen films of the 80s, things like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, The Breakfast Club, Say Anything, films like this were fun. They had moments of drama, but they were predominantly fun. And they weren't sanitized, they weren't super clean. They had fair amount of profanity. They had a fair amount of references to sex and drugs and so on. So they couldn't be described as like super sanitized. Far from it. But I mean, most comedies today just seem to be like comedy in general, shock for shock's sake. To me, just over the top. I mean, I quite liked Ted, the first Ted with Mark Wahlberg. I watched the second one. I wasn't overly impressed. I thought the idea was good, but it was kind of ruined by just excessiveness. The idea of it was just ruined by going over the top, just making the bear a little, I don't know, swearing like a sailor, and just there was something about it that I thought fell flat for me. And there were funny moments, but fell flat by just. I thought at one point, yeah, they're just trying too hard here to be shocking. Um, I mean, let me make a comparison just to kind of exemplify what I'm talking about. Take a sports drama, Rocky Four versus Creed Two. Now they both involve Sylvester Stallone, so there are obvious similarities, and they're both within the Rocky arc, right? The Rocky universe. Although Creed obviously revolves around Adonis Creed. Um, Creed 2 is a direct link to Rocky 4. They both involve the Russian fighter Ivan Drago. In this case, it's a son. Now, I thought Creed 2 was a good film. I thought the fight scenes were fantastic in terms of being brutally realistic. I thought there was definitely memorable bits in the film, but it was missing one crucial thing. There was no upbeat ending. There was no feel good music to round the film off. This is something that 80s films were very good at. Now, okay, we can call it a little bit maybe utopian and unrealistic, but so many 80s films, it was kind of a trope of the 80s. Like you'd have kind of boy meets girl, boy saves girl, but girl wasn't pushover necessarily. There'd be redemption, there'd be a good ending, there'd be feel good music, there'd just be that was the 80s. I mean, Karate Kid, again, it wasn't a comedy film. It had dramatic moments. It was involving subjects like bullying, and yet what happened? The kid, wins. He evens out things with the bullies. Then the bullies make up with him in the end, and it's feel good music. I think something's just been lost, and I find that really unfortunate. I would never dismiss an entire decade. I think some people make that mistake. They kind of say, "Oh, the past was all the good old days was all good, and the present's all bad." I'm not that cynical. I certainly don't believe that. I mean, the 80s was, the Cold War was still very much at its peak, um, and certainly in some areas, I think society will have progressed, but I just think something has changed, and I guess I'm focusing on the 80s because that's when I was born, as opposed to the 70s or the 60s. Um, I love the 80s. Funny thing is, I didn't when I was younger. But there's maybe another thing about the 80s, and to an extent the 90s. These were decades in which digital technology was fast developing. It's definitely the modern world, and yet it wasn't a world that was getting really overrun with reality TV, with social media, things which I think are predominantly negative. Well, maybe more reality TV than social media, but definitely I think social media is kind of a Frankenstein's monster. It has many good aspects, but I'm starting to wonder if the bad aspects are outweighing the good. I don't know. The jury's out on that. But I mean, when we look back on the 2010s, and I'll be doing a review of the whole decade, like towards the end of the year, maybe even in early 2020. Is there going to be memorable sort of film scores in the way that the original Rocky film scores were memorable, in the way that Karate Kid was memorable, in the way that Star Wars even was memorable? And I'm not a massive Star Wars fan, but it's a great theme tune. One of the films in the 70s, two in the 80s. Um, I don't know. I just think, a lot of decades from, let's say, the 20s up to the 90s are very easy to define in terms of culture, in terms of music, popular culture. The last two decades can be defined by geopolitical events. That's not so difficult. We think of 9/11, the war on terror, Arab Spring, Brexit, issues like this. So politically, there, you can identify them with a time period, but culturally, I think it's a bit harder. I mean, what is the music of the 2010s? That's quite hard to define. We think of the 70s, we think of disco music, right? We think of, and I'm not saying it was only that, but we think of the disco scene, we think of maybe metal music, rock. I don't know, just something has changed. And I don't know if it's for the better. I guess a lot of it depends on personal life experience as well. I mean, someone who was miserable in the 80s and is having a very good life now would obviously feel differently. So that's also a big factor of what's happening in people's personal lives. But we're about to get into the 20s. The 20s. So I wonder, will the 20s be easy to define? I wonder what will happen geopolitically. I wonder what the culture will be. Will the world be consumed by social media to a point of no return? Are we already there? Sometimes I think I would have fitted very well into the 80s. I don't know. I mean, not as a baby, which I was, but as a young man, as a teenager, which would put me in my early 50s now. I don't know. Um, Sometimes I wonder, am I part of a lost generation in the sense that we find our times a bit harder to find. But then again, maybe every generation feels that way on some level. I don't know. These are interesting questions and questions I think that are worth thinking about. So just to conclude, I'm certainly not dismissing the 2010s. I've seen many good films this decade, and I've there's songs that I like, but I wouldn't like automatically say this is the best decade for music for me personally. That's entirely subjective, of course, but it's very hard to define. Um, I think a lot of music now to me is just generic. It's just it doesn't move me in the way that, and again, this is entirely subjective. I accept that, but I just don't get moved by music. Even thinking of the Bond themes, I think the graphics and the special effects and all of the Craig era are the best. But for me, the songs are they're okay, but they're not. I think some of the older songs are better. That is entirely subjective. Okay, I'll round it up there. Let me know when you were born and what you think about this subject. Okay, thanks for watching.